A 140-million-year-old limestone core sealing a high-purity iron hammer. A deep-sea bronze wreck revealing a gear matrix capable of calculating the solar system. Prehistoric gold artifacts demonstrating fighter jet-level aerodynamic layouts in wind tunnels. When the fundamental laws of physics are shattered, one hypothesis suggests 800-ton megaliths were hoisted via acoustic levitation, while the Dogon people mapped the orbit of Sirius's companion star with the naked eye, perfectly matching Hubble's observations. These unsolved phenomena hurl a relentless question at us. Is human civilization a linear evolution or a cyclical reboot? In June 1936, a geological anomaly occurred along the banks of Red Creek in the heart of Texas. In the early Cretaceous geological formations at 32 degrees 23 minutes north and 97 degrees 80 minutes west, a limestone nodule featuring a severely carbonized wooden handle was pulled from the wilderness. The shell encasing it was strictly defined as lower strata material from the dinosaur age, dating back 140 million years. In 1947, this prehistoric limestone camouflage was violently shattered, exposing a 6-inch-long, 1-inch diameter metal hammerhead to the air, with one end of the wooden handle entirely embedded within the metal cavity. A highly modern metallurgical artifact had just broken out of a 140-million-year-old geological fault line. Subsequent spectrochemical analysis by the Battelle Memorial Institute delivered a set of data that directly violated modern industrial smelting logic. The test report showed the hammerhead was composed of 96.6% pure iron, 2.6% chlorine, and 0.74% sulfur, with an absolute 0% of carbon. Any iron lacking carbon should be structurally as fragile as a sponge, and in any known high-temperature smelting process, a highly reactive element like chlorine cannot be stably locked inside a metal crystal lattice. Furthermore, after decades of cutting tests since its exposure, the high-purity iron body never produced a single micron of iron oxide rust. The wooden structure inside the cavity exhibited advanced coalification, a process standard geological models dictate requires tens of millions of years of extreme heat and pressure. Yet the exposed handle showed only slight mineralization, retaining clear tree ring patterns. The exact same piece of wood displayed a geological evolutionary gap of tens of millions of years within a distance of just a few inches. In 1984, a radical hypothesis emerged, with the Creation Evidence Museum exhibiting the artifact as an engineering tool left behind by an advanced pre-flood human civilization, arguing that a highly pressurized, oxygen-rich vapor canopy enveloped the ancient Earth, granting ancient humans cutting-edge cold fusion metallurgical technology. However, a rigorous physical investigation required aiming the crosshairs at the original limestone nodule itself. Independent geological researcher Glenn Kubin cross-referenced samples from the Red Creek riverbed and discovered that the rock encasing the hammer was not a slice of the original ancient strata, but a highly active carbonate deposition phenomenon known as calcareous tufa. Under specific karst hydrological conditions, when groundwater rich in calcium bicarbonate reaches the surface, a sudden drop in pressure causes dissolved carbon dioxide to escape, rapidly converting the minerals into insoluble calcium carbonate that swallows foreign objects and calcifies them into rock nodules in a very short period. The microscopic physical scene reconstruction yielded a harsh engineering profile. This was highly likely a 19th-century American miner's hammer, dropped into a limestone fissure over a century ago. The 96.6% iron and lack of carbon perfectly matched the wrought iron forging techniques prevalent before the widespread adoption of the Bessemer process, which contained heavy slag. The chlorine and sulfur were industrial flaws, introduced when blacksmiths forced impurities from low-grade coal into the iron ore lattice during primitive smelting. Its rust-defying physical performance stemmed from a dense, natural passivation layer formed by microscopic iron oxide mixed with residual limestone crystals. The coalification of the handle was merely a dark oxidation and localized mineral replacement reaction caused by submerged wood fibers in mineral-rich water. Its internal cellulose network remained intact. This supposedly modern artifact, implanted into ancient strata, was in reality a physical reshaping by geological fluids over an incredibly short time frame. As we shift our gaze from chronological geological displacement to the compression of mechanical computing power, the violation of physical dimensions takes on an even colder form. In 1900, a violent storm forced Greek sponge divers into a 150-foot abyss off the coast of Antikythera. Amidst tons of salvaged marble statues from an ancient Roman shipwreck lay a bronze remnant, roughly the size of a modern dictionary, encased in thick marine limestone. In 1902, an archaeologist spotted a perfect triangular bronze gear tooth protruding from the eroding limestone crevices. The presence of precision gears in a 1st century BC shipwreck constituted an absolute discontinuity in human mechanical history. In 1971, physicist Derek de Sola Price teamed up with radiography expert Charalambos Karakalos, using a cobalt-60 source and powerful gamma rays to conduct a penetrating scan of the patina-covered lump. The negatives revealed terrifying engineering data on a two-dimensional plane. Packed within a bronze casing less than 4 inches thick was a dense matrix of 27 interlocking precision gears of varying sizes, separated by mere millimeters. One massive main gear, featuring exactly 235 teeth, perfectly corresponded to the Metonic cycle in ancient Greek astronomy, tracking the 19-year repetition of lunar phases. In the late 1980s, mechanical engineering curator Michael Wright built a 1,500-pound linear tomography scanner, conducting over 700 microscopic X-ray slices of the fragments. At the core, he discovered an epicyclic gearing system, a mechanism Europe's master watchmakers supposedly wouldn't invent until the 17th century. Ancient Greek engineers had mounted 2 gears off-center, dropping a pin from one into the slot of the other, directly utilizing angular velocity to perfectly simulate the moon's elliptical acceleration and deceleration. The ability to hard-code abstract astrophysical laws directly into precision mechanics completely shattered the linear timeline of technological evolution. In 2005, the Antikythera Mechanism Research Project brought in top-tier Silicon Valley computing power and industrial flaw detection technology. Hewlett-Packard's polynomial texture mapping stripped away visual noise from the bronze surface, extracting over 3,400 microscopic Greek characters less than 2 millimeters tall. This was a rigorous operating manual detailing color codes for Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Following this, an 8-ton microfocus computerized tomography scanner bombarded the fragments with 450,000 volts of X-rays, generating ultra-high-definition 3D volumetric data at a 50-micron resolution. The 3D rendering reconstructed a miniature mechanical universe. The total gear count jumped to 35, spread across 82 scanned fragments. The Sirius cycle dial, used to predict solar and lunar eclipses, was driven by a 223-tooth gear. Under X-ray, the dimensions, angles, and spacing of these 223 equilateral triangular teeth, hand-filed by ancients, were nearly identical, with error margins locked down to fractions of a millimeter. The operator simply turned a hand crank on the side, and the central crown gear drove the massive differential gear array. Pointers on the front dial swept across the ancient Egyptian calendar and the zodiac with extreme precision, showing the sun's exact position on the ecliptic, while a black and silver sphere displayed real-time lunar phases. The back featured a spiral dial tracking the 19-year Metonic cycle, and a lower dial acting as a 223-month Saros cycle tracker, capable of predicting the exact date and hour of a total solar or partial lunar eclipse decades into the future, including the direction and color of the shadow. Carbon-14 dating placed the shipwreck around 70 BC, while reverse engineering the eclipse sequences locked the machine's manufacturing date between 205 BC and 100 BC. In an era before paper was even popularized, this massive computing differential gear network locked the time and space of the solar system into microscopic physical engagement. Moving from the deep-sea analog computer to the Andes Mountains of South America, the chronological displacement of manufacturing techniques is pushed to its absolute limit in the realm of aerodynamics. Housed in the Gold Museum in Bogota, Colombia, are microcastings of pure gold alloys classified as pre-Columbian artifacts. Measuring just 2 inches long, 1.9 inches wide, and weighing under 10 grams, radiocarbon dating pins their creation strictly between 300 and 1000 AD. Orthodox classification labels them as animal totems with religious undertones, but through the lens of aerodynamics, their geometric symmetry displays the precise layout of a scaled-down, forward-swept delta-wing supersonic fighter jet. The nose features an obtuse conical transition, specifically utilized in interceptors breaking the sound barrier to effectively attenuate shock-wave drag. The fuselage lacks the flexible wings biological markers dictate. Instead, it utilizes smooth, rigid, perfectly symmetrical chamfered delta main wings. The forward-swept angle of the wings perfectly matches the lift-to-drag ratio specifications required for modern high-aspect ratio jets penetrating high-altitude airspace at high speeds. The tail section features a vertical stabilizer that defies any evolutionary law of Earth's biology, which, combined with the horizontal stabilizers at the bottom, constitutes a textbook modern three-surface aerodynamic control system. In 1994, a German flight data validation team obtained precise surveying drafts of the artifact, upscaling it at a 1:16 ratio into a test model with a nearly 3-foot wingspan. Without altering a single curve of the original indigenous aerodynamics, they implanted a high-power brushless propeller motor and precision servos. Across over 100 recorded test flights, this aircraft, carrying the genetic code of a millennia-old South American jungle, demonstrated an exceptional aerodynamic lift-to-drag ratio, effortlessly executing high-angle rapid climbs, barrel rolls, and high-G inside loops. In unpowered glide tests with the engine killed, it relied on the downwash generated by the delta wings to drift with a negligible sink rate, achieving perfect three-point landings. This macro-physical validation ruthlessly proved that the ancient metallurgists grasped Bernoulli's fluid dynamics, boundary layer control, and dynamic balance calculus. In 2025, a top-tier aerodynamic assessment of these ancient artifacts was published. Researchers brought ultra-high-resolution photogrammetry scanners into the museum to capture micron-level 3D point cloud data, reconstructing an error-free digital twin model that was fed into an ANSYS computational fluid dynamics supercomputer matrix. The test environment was hardcore anchored to the high-altitude region where the artifacts were unearthed. An atmospheric static pressure of 7,079.9 pascals, a temperature of 57 degrees Fahrenheit, and 55% relative humidity. As the simulated airspeed surged to 100 feet per second and the angle of attack was pushed to its 15-degree limit, the sensor feedback obliterated any pseudo-scientific excuses of coincidence. Its peak lift coefficient spiked to an incredibly anomalous 1.87. Radar charts clearly showed that as the test airflow passed over the absolutely symmetrical delta wings, the leading edge smoothly induced a powerful leading edge vortex. These miniature tornadoes clung tightly to the upper surface of the wings, creating a massive negative pressure zone, while the drag coefficient remained locked at a minimal value. This ultimate low-drag, high-lift aerodynamic layout is statistically impossible for prehistoric natives to randomly hammer out around a campfire without the computational backing of Navier-Stokes equations and tens of thousands of wind tunnel tests. The Quimbaya and Tolima peoples, deemed by mainstream academia as primitive agriculturalists who had not even invented the wooden wheel, expertly and extravagantly utilized lost wax precision casting techniques with gold-copper alloys melting at over 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. The lost wax method meant ancient craftsmen had to first sculpt a perfectly symmetrical beeswax prototype. During the cooling and shrinking of the liquid metal, asymmetrical deformation of the wings is highly probable. Yet the surviving artifacts exhibit a despairingly perfect axial symmetry. The center of gravity is precisely locked just forward of the aerodynamic center of the main wing, the core rule of longitudinal static stability required for modern atmospheric flight. This is no primitive religious imagination. Extrapolated from rigorous aerodynamic test data, it reads more like a prehistoric battlefield record of a highly advanced aerial vehicle making a low-altitude pass or sonic boom landing. The ancient metalworkers used the highest level of precision metallurgy available to them to lock this trans-era aerospace engineering marvel into a golden time capsule. When modern multi-million-dollar supercomputers use fluid dynamics to simulate it today, its magnificent posture, slicing through the boundary layer at a 15-degree angle of attack, throws an unauthorized industrial roar directly at modern humanity. The blinding sun of the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon beats down on the foundation of the Temple of Jupiter at Baalbek, where the fracture of physical common sense is violently magnified on a macro-architectural scale. The survey data presents suffocating engineering pressure. 3 massive limestone blocks serving as the load-bearing foundation, averaging 62 feet long, 13 feet high, and 11 feet thick, with a precise individual weight of approximately 800 tons. The Sheikh Abdallah Quarry, located half a mile away, houses the 1,000-ton Stone of the Pregnant Woman, the 1,242-ton Stone of the South, and the 1,650-ton Forgotten Stone, unearthed by the German Archaeological Institute in 2014. Against this absolute mass, which would push a fleet of modern heavy crawler cranes to their metal fatigue limits, the traditional archaeological model of thousands of slaves dragging them with wooden rollers and hemp ropes becomes mathematically fragile. A visually striking hypothesis of acoustic levitation seeped into this physical debate through ancient texts. 10th-century Arab historian al-Masudi recorded that ancient Egyptian builders placed papyrus inscribed with symbols under massive stones and struck them with a metal rod to make them glide. A more detailed eyewitness account comes from Dr. Jarl, a Swedish doctor in Tibet in 1939. His logs precisely described 19 musicians and 200 monks forming a quarter circle with a 200-foot radius, using specific frequency beats from 13 giant drums and 6 massive horns to levitate boulders up a cliff via acoustic resonance. This spectacle, forcefully stitching primitive labor limits to anti-gravity technology, constructed a surreal construction site devoid of ropes or logs, relying purely on priests to levitate 800-ton prehistoric stones. Under the microscope of the modern Argonne National Laboratory, this romantic acoustic radiation pressure theory met a brutal mathematical execution. Acoustic levitation is a real mechanism, relying on two intersecting sound waves creating a standing wave, using extreme acoustic radiation pressure at the antinodes to counteract gravity. But the energy conversion ratios are ruthless. Levitating a single gram of water in a lab requires an extreme sound pressure of 160 decibels. Applying this formula to an 800-ton limestone block pushes the required sound pressure well past the absolute physical limit of 240 decibels. For context, a Saturn V rocket launch generates about 204 decibels. As sound pressure approaches 240 decibels, sound waves transform into lethal shock waves. The air medium compresses to the edge of turning into plasma, generating heat that would melt the rock's surface, and any priest or alloy instrument would be instantly pulverized and liquefied within a millisecond. The rugged terrain of the quarry could never provide the perfectly flat reflective surface required for a standing wave, making ancient acoustic levitation a purely romantic delusion wrapped in scientific jargon. Stripping away physics-defying acoustic magic reveals the hardcore engineering tracks beneath. First-century Roman Empire engineers demonstrated the ultimate exploitation of mechanical advantage. Stonemasons drove dry wooden wedges into deep trenches, constantly soaking them with water to utilize the tens of tons of expansive force to tear the megalith from the bedrock. Geological surveys reconstructed a heavy load ramp built over years, featuring a compacted gravel base topped with smooth stone slabs and solid oak tracks. Abandoning vertical pulleys and fragile wooden rollers, the Romans placed the stones on massive, flat-bottomed wooden sleds, coating the tracks in thick animal fat and cheap olive oil. On the mechanical traction end, iron anchors were driven into dovetail slots, and dozens of massive wooden capstans were rigged in parallel through complex pulley systems. In this system of extreme lubrication and violent tension, the horizontal pulling force required to overcome friction dropped exactly to between 40 and 80 tons. Hundreds of slaves turned the capstans, and the only role sound played was the raw, rhythmic drumming of the overseer synchronizing the mechanical output. Human flesh and blood, utilizing the most primitive laws of physics and mechanical geometry matrices, dragged these megaliths straight into the monument of history. As the dimensional limits of physics and mechanics are reeled in by Roman engineering, the perspective ascends to the boundless deep space of astrophysics. In October 1946, beneath the red sandstone of the Bandiagara escarpment in central Mali, West Africa, Ogotemeli, the blind high priest of the Dogon tribe, traced a seemingly random ellipse and an off-center dot in the yellow sand with his withered finger. To French anthropologists Marcel Griol and Germain Dieterlen, this was merely a routine recording of tribal mythology. It wasn't until decades later, when the high-resolution lenses of the Hubble Space Telescope focused on the Canis Major constellation 8.6 light-years away, that astrophysicists realized the orbital model of Sirius's companion white dwarf perfectly and flawlessly matched the crude shape drawn in the sand by the blind Dogon priest. As an inland, early Iron Age agricultural tribe with zero foundation in glass smelting, the Dogon people's field of vision completely bypassed the incredibly long evolutionary timeline of modern astronomy. The blinding -1.46 apparent magnitude of Sirius A completely masked the microscopic companion star orbiting right next to it. Modern astronomy only barely caught a glimpse of it in 1862 when Alvin Graham Clark tested an 18-inch refractor. Walter Adams confirmed it as a white dwarf in 1915, and Arthur Eddington calculated its terrifying density in 1928. The Dogon, lacking any modern optical equipment, not only knew of this completely invisible star, but named it Po-Tolo. Po is the fonio grain, the smallest known volume in Africa, and Tolo means star. The high priest dictated that this star was filled with an incredibly heavy metal called sagala, asserting that the combined strength of every living being on Earth could not lift a single grain of it. This vernacular metaphor perfectly pierced the core physics of a white dwarf. Its volume is merely 8% larger than Earth, but its mass equals our Sun, meaning a single teaspoon of its matter weighs dozens of tons on Earth. Even more chilling to the modern scientific community were the incredibly strict parameters of time and spatial geometry. The Dogon's Sigui festival cycle occurs every 60 years, but in top-secret oral traditions, the core mechanical cycle of the star was locked firmly at 50 years. The high priest explicitly stated that Po-Tolo requires exactly 50 years to complete one orbit around Sirius. Modern observatory calculations show the actual physical orbital period is 50.09 years. The off-center placement of the star in the sand drawing perfectly aligns with the first law of planetary motion proposed by Kepler in the 17th century. The Dogon mythology, which firmly asserted the existence of a third companion star, Ya-Tolo, and its orbiting planet, was corroborated in 1995 when French astronomers Daniel Benest and J.L. Duvin analyzed gravitational perturbations to deduce the highly probable existence of a red dwarf in the system. In Griol's archives, published in 1950, the Dogon's macro-microcosmic model clearly labeled Jupiter's 4 Galilean moons, Saturn's outer rings, and explicitly defined Earth as a sphere suspended in space, rotating on its axis and revolving around the Sun, even detailing the spiral vortex structure of the Milky Way galaxy. Tracing the origin of this counterintuitive, high-dimensional knowledge, the highly classified Dogon creation myth reveals a cold, documentary realism stripped of any mystical idealism. The myth clearly records that in ancient times, accompanied by a deafening roar and a fierce whirlwind tearing the sky, amphibious higher life forms known as the Nomo descended directly to Earth from the Sirius system in a red arc. The extreme heat from the arc's thrusters instantly melted the surrounding sand into hard glass crystals upon touchdown. The Nomo taught the laws of cosmic mechanics before hiding in the Earth's deep oceans to maintain their vital signs. This hardcore physical realism, featuring metallic descents, thermal thruster burns, and extraterrestrial reliance on specific aquatic ecosystems, was fiercely attacked in 1979 by astronomer Carl Sagan's cultural contamination hypothesis. Sagan theorized these facts were trendy scientific news spread by European explorers or soldiers around campfires in the 1920s, rapidly stitched into the high priest's mythology. However, against a chain of extreme, deep-dive empirical evidence, the logic of the cultural contamination hypothesis totally fractures. Isotope laboratories conducted rigorous carbon-14 dating on the Sirius wooden masks used to calculate the long-cycle Sigui calendars in the Dogon sacrificial pits. The timber harvesting and carving dates were precisely pegged between the 13th and 15th centuries. The deep pigment weathering and surface patina of the red ochre Sirius eccentric orbit cave paintings undeniably point to centuries of historical accumulation. A random European missionary traversing the West African interior in the early 20th century could never have preemptively mastered the precise 50-year orbital period and Kepler's eccentric laws, data that top-tier scientists were still struggling to map out, let alone force those astrophysical parameters to appear in the carbon isotopes of timber and ancient rock art centuries beforehand. When the high-purity iron hammer sealed in 140-million-year-old rock, the deep-sea bronze differential gear matrix, the prehistoric gold forward-swept delta wing roaring in the wind tunnel, and the Hubble-tier astronomical star charts on the yellow sand of deep Africa interweave into an impenetrable, high-energy information web. The linear technological timeline, long constructed by modern civilization, faces a total collapse. These hardcore data fragments, scattered across geological strata, deep oceans, and deserts, are no longer archaeological static that can be casually dismissed as coincidence or totem worship.